Schwartz here from Sales for Nerds, kicking off the Sales for Nerds podcast. If you feel more comfortable with SQL than sales calls, more at home writing test suites than proposals, more interested in crunching numbers than shaking hands, if you think networking should be about routers rather than cocktails with strangers, if you're more interested in debating code editors than negotiating deals, but somehow you ended up responsible for some of those sales and marketing activities, this is the podcast for you.
Welcome. Today we're going to do a little bit of an experimental episode where instead of interviewing a guest, I'm going to be addressing a question that I get all the time. And in addition, I'm not going to be sharing wine. I'm going to have a glass of whiskey. Couple things about that. First of all, whiskey, you can just have a glass, put the cork back in, and not have to worry about keeping the bottle. So that's real nice. And then the other thing that's interesting, based on the topic of this episode, this bottle of whiskey, this is a 14-year-old Highland whiskey from Oban. Really nice. Some vanilla, some honey. I usually prefer the peatier malts, but I like this because it's got a little bit of flavor to it. And a bottle of this probably goes for about $70, $75 or so. Far more than I would want to spend on a bottle of wine. But the nice thing is, if you think about it, there's probably about 24 servings in here. It's $3, maybe a little bit less per serving, and you don't have to worry about spoilage. So even though it's very expensive, it's got tremendous value. So what we're going to talk about today is pricing. How do you price your stuff? What number do you put in your proposal? I think of all the topics that come up frequently, this is the one that seems to cause the most stress and the most uncertainty. And it also has a tremendous impact on the success of your business. So I wanted to devote a little bit of time to the topic of pricing. So first of all, when we think about pricing, we usually think about what are we selling? And for a lot of people, that's selling hours or time, ourselves, our staff, so on. But the real question is, what do customers actually buy? Are they buying hours? In some cases, they might be, right? They might, if you hire a security guard for 8 hours just to stand outside an event, you actually are literally buying hours. If you hire a security guard to protect your billionaire client, you might be looking at something slightly different. And, there's a common saying, people don't want to buy drills, they want to buy holes. They may even want to have someone drill the holes for them so they can do something else, to do something else, to do something else, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to think about, what do customers actually buy? And a lot of the pricing challenges are because people are not sure what people are buying, so they try to price what they're selling. We're going to go into a little bit more detail on this in just a second. But first of all, let's think about, why is this important? And just to quote some really simple math here. Imagine your business does $1 million in revenue at 10% margin. So as the owner, you would take home $100,000. If you can raise your price by 1%, you've made 1% more revenue. But if you can do that without losing business, you've made 10% more profit. If you could raise your prices 3%, you'd raise profit by 30%, 5%, 50%, and so on. I had one customer who raised prices by 30%, so you can imagine what that did to profitability. So very small changes in price can have an enormous impact on your business, but a lot of people don't spend a lot of time thinking strategically about price, let alone tactically, when they're actually executing price. So let's start by defining, what's the pricing window that we have? What's the envelope, the high and low? So if we price below our variable costs, we lose money. And you can make an argument that companies like Uber and other folks that raise a ton of outside investment are actually deliberately pursuing this strategy of selling below their variable costs in the hope of making it up when they hit some kind of scale or milestone. But for most of us, variable costs define the hard limit under which we can't sell. Now, these are hard to estimate really well, but generally we have some idea what our costs are. If we're paying for staff members, we know how much it costs us, not just in their salary, but their benefits and their equipment and their the phone system that we need for them, and so on and so forth. And if we know, for example, that their utilization rate is 70%, we know we can kind of back into what minimally we need to be able to charge for them to actually make money. Hard to know exactly the right number for cost, it gets kind of complicated. Are things fixed or variable costs? How do you allocate fixed costs, and so on and so forth? But we can have some idea, and this is generally how folks do it. They think about adding up their costs, adding some kind of margin, and then they end up anchoring their price around their costs. And if you're a commodity, this is what ends up happening, right? Prices get driven down to variable costs. So if you're selling a barrel of oil or a bushel of corn or something that maybe isn't a true commodity on the commodities market, but something that is considered, gosh, I don't want to pay that. I can outsource this job to some third party or some other country for a fraction of the price. They're basically saying, hey, it's a commodity. You don't bring anything to the table. Let's go for the lowest common denominator and price based on that. Now, obviously, this is going to be the most restrictive on your pricing. If you're a commodity, you don't have any pricing power. The market sets the price for commodities. Most of us do not want to be in the commodities market. So what's our alternative? Well, the upper end of the pricing window is limited by perceived differential value. And I'm going to say that again, perceived differential value. So people often talk about value-based pricing, but it's sort of this hand-wavy exercise. What does value really mean? First of all, it's perceived by whom? By the buyer, not by the seller. So I could think that I have the most amazing thing ever, but if the buyer doesn't perceive the value, then it doesn't matter. For example, there was a company that made parts that went into semiconductor factories, and they had developed this part that instead of having to be replaced every 2 or 3 years would last 10 plus years, that even warranty it for 10 years. Tremendous value. Unfortunately, the people who bought this part only were in that job for 2 years. They literally could not care less about what happened 10 years down the road, and they had no incentive to invest in something that was more expensive in the short term, that would make their budget numbers look worse. They couldn't get a premium price for this amazing device. So the other thing that's important is it's not just the perception, it's also the differential value. That means we're comparing this to something else. Value does not exist in an abstract, ether, Newtonian, or a Platonic sense. We're making a trade-off between two different alternatives. So, for example, these semiconductor folks were comparing one device against another device, their alternative. Many times you compare against direct competition, right? If I'm comparing two different parts for a semiconductor fab line, or if I'm thinking of buying two different computers, or I'm thinking of hiring two different lawyers, but to do the same task, they're probably fairly close in competition. In many cases, there may also be indirect competition. Instead of just competing with airlines also have to compete with video conferencing, for example. And then one of the most important alternatives is the status quo. If you end up with a lot of no decisions where people say, gosh, we've spent all this time and we've thought about it a bunch, but we're just going to think about it some more. Basically, the status quo is winning. Why is the status quo winning? Well, because the perceived differential value is not compelling. So how do we know what the prospect values? How do we know how much it's worth to them? We already said that it's hard enough for us to estimate our own costs. That means that it's going to be hard in many cases for the buyer to estimate their costs. For example, if we're trying to do a cost-saving based value. Well, it starts off by asking and not just assuming that we know everything about the prospect and that our technology or our service is so great. Let the prospect talk about what their problem is and why it's important to solve it. And they're often really happy to tell you why it's so important to solve it. And they might also tell you some things about what it means to solve it well, so that if you understand that, you can truly solve their real problem and not just check off the box for the first level problem. This is often super helpful for differentiating. So for example, if someone says, I need a new website. Well, website services at this point are fairly commoditized, but if they say, I need a website to do X and Y and Z, and I need it to increase sales by $1 million a month, and I need to do it with minimal hand-holding because I've got some other thing that I need to go deal with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Suddenly you have a much better idea of what the real value is than somebody who just says, I need a new website, or even I need a new website that increases sales. There's a big difference between somebody spending a little bit of money on a website, somebody spending a ton of money on a website, how much time you can invest in truly understanding the prospect's value. But if you're not doing a super transactional deal, right? At the supermarket, no one says, gosh, I know you'd be willing to spend an extra $3 on this chicken. I'm going to try to charge you $3. You just go and you run it through the checkout line and it rings up. It's entirely transactional. Now, there are places in the world where if you go buy a chicken in the market, they're going to bargain with you and they're going to try to do some of that. At the other end of the spectrum, have a company like Boeing versus Airbus. There's a very small number of potential deals in the market. Each deal is incredibly valuable. And so the sales reps at those companies go into tremendous detail about what's going on in a particular deal. Most of us are going to end up somewhere in between the supermarket and the super jumbo, where we need to know something about what our prospect is thinking, what they care about, why they care about it, and how do they define success. Now, the nice thing is most of your competitors are not asking these questions. So they're going to throw out a number that's going to be commodity-based. It's going to be based on their services and technology. It's kind of inside out. If you can be outside in and really understand what the prospect values, you have a much better chance of, first of all, knowing if you have a good fit or if you don't. If you don't, the best thing to do is to get out of there. A lot of times people waste a lot of pricing power because they're pursuing deals where they don't have a good fit, they don't have good perceived differential value. This not only eats up a lot of your time, even if you win the deal, now sometimes your good customers who really do value what you sell, they find out someone else is getting a better deal and you've suddenly eroded a lot of your margin. Try to ask good questions, ask open-ended questions, let the customer talk. This is something that's come up again and again in various episodes on Sales for Nerds, but let the customer do the talking. You're almost like the interviewer. And think about some of your buying experiences, right? When was the last time you bought something purely on price? And you can probably think of something, but I'm willing to bet that if you go back and you really scratch your head harder, was there a less expensive alternative? Probably, right? Maybe you could have avoided buying the thing entirely, or you could have bought something that you bought new, bought it used. You could have used a friend of the family instead of outsourcing to a professional, and so on and so forth. There's almost always some value component, even when we say there's a price, it's a price-driven decision. Unless we're buying a pure commodity, there's something that we need that causes some element of value to come into the equation. And even if we're buying a commodity, well, gosh, do we need it delivered? Do we need it delivered within a certain window of time? Do we need to be able to return it if it's unused, et cetera, et cetera? There's all kinds of things that wrap around the commodities that help us understand what we're really buying and selling. So if you think about starting with a commodity, wrap that up in a product, you can wrap that up in a service, you can wrap that in an experience, and you can wrap that at the top of the scale in a transformation. And as you go up that scale, you get more and more pricing power, but of course you have to deliver more and more value. When was the last time you really bought something that was sort of expensive or on the high end, right? It could be a nice whiskey, could be an iPhone, nice meal at a restaurant, all kinds of things we could have bought for our business where quality was really important, delivery was really important. What was that experience like? I think one of the things that typically happens is the experience is focused on the value. It's focused on what you're going to get. And if it's the right thing for you, you're going to appreciate that and not worry too much about the price, right? I was talking about how I wouldn't buy a $70 bottle of wine. Well, I might, I guess, if I was out at a restaurant, for example, right? So there's different ways that comes into play, but I consider that this whiskey is good value. Now, there's other whiskey that might be even better, but if it's $1,000 a bottle or something, I'm not even going to consider that. But if it's something that works in my price range, I'm thinking about the value, not about the price. Conversely, experiences where you're focused on price, for example, fast food, there's a huge emphasis on price. The quality is not as important. It has to meet a certain level of acceptability, but you're not getting the same experience you are at the nice, fancy restaurant. So think about when you're selling, what kind of experience do your customers want to get? What kind of experience do you offer them? Do those things go together? It doesn't mean you have to be super fancy and spend money on things that don't matter to your customers. It just means, what are they looking for? And many times customers are looking for a level of reassurance that comes with a certain kind of buying experience. For example, if I went to a restaurant that was supposed to have really good food, but it looked like a hole-in-the-wall fast food restaurant, and then they said, gosh, the entrees are $50 a piece, that would seem really weird. I could go to a hole-in-the-wall and maybe instead of charging $5, they charge $10 because it's really good, but you probably can't get $50 if you've got a hole-in-the-wall type atmosphere. At the same time, if you go in and it's super fancy and the entrees are $5, something's off as well. So you want that whole customer buying experience to flow in a natural way so that there's not cognitive dissonance on the customer's part. Going back to our pricing window, we've got between variable cost and perceived differential value. The variable cost approach is sort of the inside out approach. Outside in is the value-based approach. A lot of us kind of default to inside out or cost-based, and we leave so much money on the table because we don't really bother to understand the value. We put a price out there. Sometimes customers complain, sometimes they don't. They don't complain typically that the price is too low. It has happened to me from time to time, easily fixable problem, but they'll complain if the price is too high. So a lot of times we'll sort of default to that inside out. So instead of defaulting to that inside out cost-based pricing where we leave a ton of money on the table, it would be nice if we could get some sense of what the value is. And then kind of like me, if I go into the store to buy whiskey, I'm willing to spend $70 on a bottle of whiskey maybe, but not $200. I can know for my budget whether something's a good fit or not. So let's suppose that we've gone in, we've asked a bunch of questions, we feel like we have a good fit, we understand what the customer is looking for, we know that we have a fit in for the customer's budget. It doesn't do us any good to say, sometimes even if the customer says, yes, gosh, all of that's true about your value, but I just don't have the money and there's no way I can find it, at least not now. What else can you do for me, right? Don't keep hammering that into the wrong hole. It's not going to work. And sometimes people, this is sort of one of the follow-on questions, people say, well, gosh, what do I do when someone asks me for a price before I've learned all about the value? And some people say, tell them a price, give them a range. Some people say, never give them a price until after you've had the value discussion. And some of this is going to depend, of course, on your particular business. But my view is when I'm a buyer, if someone refuses to discuss price with me at all, I probably don't want to have a conversation with them because they're wasting my time. They might be wasting my time, and I don't trust them. If I'm trying to solve a problem, I understand that I want someone to actually make money to solve my problem. Otherwise, they're not going to do a good job of it. But if they can't tell me whether this is a $500 or a $500,000 type problem, how do I know whether this is worthwhile? And in many cases, I've seen situations where people say, gosh, that's out of my budget. We're not a good fit. In other cases, they might say, gosh, that little, you can't possibly be serious. So you can get disqualified either way. And as far as I'm concerned, you might as well get disqualified at the beginning rather than at the end after you've invested a bunch of time and emotional energy. So, of course, for many people, there isn't a single price. If there were, you could just say, here's what the price is. The real answer is it depends. But you can give people some kind of range, something that's reasonable. You can say, gosh, most of our projects range between $25,000 and $250,000. Obviously, that's a 10x range, but it gives you some idea. Here are some of the things that influence what end of the range we end up on. Does that sound reasonable to you? And you can go from there. The important thing is you should never walk in, get that question, and be on your heels. You know that it's coming. Be prepared to answer it. Answer it confidently and straightforwardly. You don't have to give them a number, but you should be confident. You should act like this is a question you hear all the time, and it's a perfectly reasonable question. A lot of people, they get cagey and defensive, and that really puts people off as a buyer. You've probably experienced when you've asked that question when you're trying to buy something. Same thing goes for presenting price in your proposal. And when I say proposal here, not quote, depending on the kind of relationship you have with your customer, for example, and depending on what you're selling, if it is more of just a product or commodity, you may just be able to get away with a quote, or if it's repeat business, you can just say, gosh, here's what you're buying, here's how much it costs. But at the beginning, for the folks that I talk to, where you need to have a conversation with your customer to figure out what they want and put together a solution for them, don't just give them a number, give them a proposal. And maybe we'll do a subsequent episode on the secrets of proposals. But the key thing is you're wrapping your price in a story. It's not just a number. You're going to present the value and then the price. If I present the price first, everything gets anchored to the price. If I present the value first, you can say, is it worth this investment to get this value? Now, of course, some people are just going to skip ahead to the pricing page. There's not necessarily something you can do about that. But if that's how they're going to buy, they may or may not be the right fit for you. And let's face it, we all want to know how much stuff is going to cost. But present the price after the value and do it confidently. If you've laid out the story, the value story properly, they should get to the pricing page and say, yep, okay, I'm willing to make that investment. Whether or not they say, gosh, I wish that was less, whether or not they say, I would be willing to pay a little bit more, it should all make sense and say, gosh, yes, if I'm going to make an extra $1 million, I'm willing to invest this 100,000 or whatever the numbers happen to be. Now, here's another thing that happens. People send off the proposal. They maybe even present the proposal. And then the prospect says, I'm going to think about it. Again, perfectly reasonable. We all have situations where we want to think about a purchasing decision. And then sometimes I get questions from people asking, gosh, I haven't heard back for a week. Should I lower my price? This is a really simple answer that I don't have to say it depends. The answer is no. Don't lower your price preemptively. Don't negotiate against yourself. If the customer hasn't come back with a price objection, why should you inject a price objection into the sales process, right? Another thing to think about is if they do come back with a price objection, price objections are buying signals. Now, in some cases, they may just be in a place where there's no good fit. And this is really just a failure of the sales process, not of the pricing decision, right? If you make it all the way to the end of the sales process and people say, this is just completely out of whack with my expectations and my budget and so on, get out of here, leave my office. There may be some things you can do there, but it shouldn't have got to that point. Usually people say, this all sounds good, but I only have $100,000 of budget and you're asking for 125. What can we do? And the natural reaction might be to say, okay, well, we'll go sharpen our pencils and see what we can do and get you to 100. What you don't want to do is just sort of reflexively cave, and you don't want to be negotiating in the moment. You want to have a plan ahead of time, not just for the price, not just for presenting the price in the proposal, but what's going to happen if there's a negotiation subsequent to that. So one simple thing you can do is present different options in your proposal. Say, we heard you wanted this. Maybe it's a new website. Who knows? Here's what we think you're asking for, sort of the middle of the road option. But we know that budget's tight, and if you wanted to pare it down to sort of the minimal project, we could take out some things and offload some other things onto you, and here's what that would look like. And if you wanted to invest a little bit more, we could do X and Y and Z that are going to add a tremendous amount of value, and that's what that would look like. And then people can come back and say, okay, I really like the middle of the road option, but I don't need this one thing, and I would like this element of the sort of the good, better, best, the best plan. Now, we don't necessarily want to be negotiating and getting nickel and dimed on every last thing, but think about it again. If you're buying, would you consider it reasonable to have this kind of conversation? And my general thought is, if I think as a buyer, I would like to be able to have that conversation, especially if I'm buying a solution that I don't fully understand and I can only properly understand in the context of the trade-offs I'm making, then give your customers, your buyers, your prospects the same options. And then another nice thing about this is, instead of the perceived differential value being you versus a competitor or you versus the status quo, it can be your plan A versus plan B versus plan C. So in some cases, you end up saving deals that you wouldn't have won otherwise because they're going to go for the cheaper plan. They thought your middle of the road option was too expensive. Maybe they were going to go with a competitor, but they're happy to go with you in a more stripped down version. And if you assemble this right, you do it in a way where you don't mind which selection the prospect takes. You probably want them to take the biggest one, but if they take the smallest one, that's okay, because you're not delivering the same value. You're not incurring the same costs and making the same commitments. You want them to be happy and do what's right for them. Now, the other thing you can do, whether or not you have multiple options, is say, okay, you don't want to pay this much, and I keep telling you that this is super valuable and it's better than the alternative. And you're saying, I don't perceive any difference in this value, so you don't want to pay for it. If you can unbundle that value and say, okay, that's fine, you can do that, and we'll just take that out, then again, everybody can win. I was working with a customer once, and they did media services for people, and they were sort of the high end of the market, and people liked them, and customer wanted to buy from them, but they said, gosh, you're 10% more expensive. I'm just having trouble justifying. I get that you have all these intangible things in your great company, but the stuff you're talking about why you're better, we just don't really care about. And some of that stuff cost a lot of money, a lot more than 10%. So we just took out the extra stuff they didn't care about, lowered the price 10% to match the competitor, won the business, and actually made more margin than we would have originally. So being able to unbundle is super helpful. You don't necessarily want to have a detailed discussion about every last line item and every last penny. But again, I kind of think of it as, if I'm the buyer, is this a reasonable question to ask? And if we're putting together some kind of custom solution for somebody, whether we're the buyer or the seller, it makes a lot of sense to say, let's work on the stuff that delivers value, and let's not work on the stuff that doesn't. Let's pay for the stuff. We're happy to pay for the stuff that delivers value. We don't want to pay for the stuff that doesn't. A lot of times solutions get really monolithic and expensive, and then it leads to dissatisfaction because too much is invested in stuff that people don't care about. And then the stuff that we really care about maybe doesn't get the attention that it deserves. So you end up with worse results than you would have, lower prices, lower profit, and less customer satisfaction. So just to recapitulate that, when people want to negotiate price, that's fine. We've all been in that situation. We need to understand ahead of time, so we're doing this rationally and not emotionally. Oh my goodness, the big deal's about to disappear. I better drop my price. Have a plan to follow, execute on it, be able to follow up with some questions, be able to present different options, be able to unbundle things, and see what's going to create a real win for people. Sometimes it's as simple as, I don't have budget for this whole project. Can we do part of it this quarter? And then get some success and get some more budget later, something like that. Now, one of the big things that comes up all the time is, what should my rate be? And one of my typical responses is, how do you know you need a rate? Well, if we do fixed fee, there's too many variables and so on and so forth. And hourly rates or daily rates or some other time-based rates, they have the advantage of being common, and it kind of limits your risk. But part of what it does is it limits what you can earn. Some customers are just going to say, we don't pay more than X dollars per hour for such and such a service. And I used to encounter that all the time, which is one of the reasons I moved away from having hourly rates. It limits the leverage you have with your time and your people's time, obviously. It's a pain in the ass to manage. You got to keep track of your time and invoice people and so on and so forth. And I think the part that I like least about hourly billing is I feel like it creates divergent incentives. If we're trying to deliver the most value we can for the customer, part of that is to do it as efficiently as possible, right? If we have some project that if we can deliver it faster, if we can automate, that's better for the customer than if we have to do things in a more cumbersome manual process. Now, I'm not saying that people would do something unethical and sort of like slow roll the project. I'm saying it doesn't create incentives for efficiency. So organizations that are used to billing by the hour, they don't invest in tools and automation and technology or training or whatever it might be that would let them deliver better results to customers faster. So over the long term, you kind of limit not just your leverage of your people, but also the amount of value you can deliver. Fixed fee pricing, of course, gets away from that, but it has its own downside, the main one being the risk. Right? What if we don't specify the project correctly and it ends up being much more expensive than we thought? Obviously, the key to this is to get really clear about what's included and what isn't, and what assumptions you're making, what you're asking the prospect to do when they have to do it. What are the consequences if they don't deliver some of what they're supposed to do to make this project successful? The prospect's going to be very good at coming back to you if you didn't deliver something and asking you to keep going, especially if it's on a fixed bid. But we have to be very clear about what their obligations are too. And the biggest problem here, of course, is actually specifying the project. How do you do that on a fixed fee basis? Usually you can't do it from one side of the canyon to another, but what you can do is build stepping stones so that you can break that big project into smaller chunks that you can actually do on a fixed bid basis. So, for example, you can even start with a paid assessment. This is what Scott Ingram was talking about in his episode. Instead of going in and creating a big fixed fee bid or offering an hourly retainer for his networking services, he would come in and say, we're going to do an assessment. It's going to cost you X amount of dollars. And after that, we'll know what we need to know to give you a proper bid. And if you want to, you can shop that bid to anybody else you want. But anyone who comes in and gives you a bid without doing that is making stuff up. And then they're going to come back and ask you for more money later. So very, very compelling pitch. Not just made him a lot of money. It was compelling because it was the right thing to do for the customer. There's a lot of stuff going on here. How do you figure out value? How do you know what people are actually buying? How do they define success? How do you negotiate? How do you unbundle things? Do you want to do hourly versus fixed fee? And any one of these topics could be a whole episode in and of itself. But I hope if you've gotten anything out of this, there's a few key points here. if you're just pricing based on cost, you're probably leaving money on the table. Got to figure out what the value is. And by value, I mean the perceived differential value. And the better you know your customers, the better you're going to be able to do there. And I think in every episode on this podcast, I have to mention something about having a specialty or having a niche, or my guests do. This is another area where if you have a niche, it's much easier to say there is differential value that the customer is going to perceive. Right? It's one thing to say I'm a doctor. It's another thing to say I'm a cardiologist. If you need heart surgery, you want a cardiologist. That's metaphorical since those guys don't set pricing the same way we do, but you get the general idea, right? If we are going to provide a service and we're really good at that, if that service has value, right, the equivalent of heart surgery on a business, we're going to be able to get a lot more money on it if we can say we've done that 10 times or 100 times versus we've done a couple of things kind of like that here and there. So think about not just your cost, but also what is the value you provide, and try to price based on value. This is going to mean in some cases that you obviously have different customers with different amounts of perceived differential value. And part of the challenge is to say, okay, we don't necessarily need to have just one price. We can have different prices for different situations. It could be different options for a single prospect. It could be different offerings that we target at different segments, different packages of solutions, and so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be one size fits all. That's the beauty of it. How much value do you actually deliver? How do you measure this? Well, you can go back and ask your current customers and clients. Did they feel they got good value? What do they like about it? How do they feel about the value we offer compared to the value they get from other vendors? Now, some people say, gosh, I'm so busy. Everything's great. I just don't have time to think about this. And one of the things I say is if you're too busy, you don't have a supply problem, you have a pricing opportunity. And going back to what we said at the beginning about the impact of pricing on profitability, especially if you're fully booked and your team is slammed, I'm not saying you want to gouge your customers, especially the folks who've been with you for a while, but it's okay for a business to raise prices, especially on your new customers. It's okay to change the product mix to be more profitable. It's going to make your life a lot better. And one of the things I noticed as I started being able to raise my rates was not only did I make a lot more money and get to work on more interesting things because people perceive me differently, I had a much better relationship with my customers because I got out of being perceived as more or less a commodity and into somebody who was considered more of a strategic partner. And it didn't matter. I said the same stuff about partnership and strategy and blah, 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 blah the whole way through. But sometimes price and perception go together. And when people are paying strategic partnership fees, they perceive you as a partner. You get more access to the people that you need. You get better support. You get more enthusiasm. You get better collaboration, and you get better results for your customer. So it's not just about, do I make more money? It's about, I'm going to have more fun working on these projects. And one of the things that I try to do is think about, if my phone rings and this person is calling me, what is my initial gut reaction before I even answer? Is it, oh, not again. These guys are killing me. Oh, I can't stand talking to these folks. They're so cheap and they're so annoying and blah, 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 blah. Or is it, I really want to talk to Bob because we're doing some amazing stuff together. And if he's calling me, he must have something important he wants to talk about. I can't wait to talk to him. And that is not simply a matter of pricing, but pricing properly is going to correlate with how you feel about picking up that phone, not just because you're making more money, but because you're going to get better alignment and better results from the customer. Sometimes people go through this and they say, gosh, yeah, I'm underpricing. I know I'm underpricing. And we work through the value and we realize that there's a substantial price increase that really should be coming. They say, I just don't know how to go in and ask for that. So here's a couple exercises you can do. One, I call the dealership test. Go into your Toyota dealer and test drive a $30,000 Toyota, and then go to the Mercedes dealer and test drive a $100,000 Mercedes and tell the dealer you really want to buy it, you love it. But it kind of does the same thing as the Toyota down the street. Can you have it for 30 grand? And what do you think the response from the sales rep is going to be? Right? It's either going to be get out or maybe go to the used car lot or whatever, or a list of reasons why they're not actually the same. And if you find those reasons compelling, maybe you buy the $100,000 Mercedes. If you don't, you go buy the Toyota. But there isn't this notion of selling you the $100,000 Mercedes for $30,000. We definitely want to avoid that. And so if you think you're selling a $100,000 Mercedes of a solution, sell it for $100,000. Maybe it ends up being $95,000. I don't know, but not $30,000. There's a different option for the people who want the $30,000 Toyota. And it's up to you to give your customers those options so that you're happy with whatever they buy. So I'm not sure if anyone has actually gone and done the dealership test because it's so obvious what's going to happen. But a lot of people I know end up on the other side of that selling their $100,000 Mercedes equivalent for $30,000. So that's the point of that whole exercise. Make sure you don't do that. Make sure you have a plan so that if someone comes in and says that, you can explain the differences and you can explain how you can get them the right fit. Now, people sometimes say, okay, great, I've got that, but I just don't know how to say that, I'm taking my rates from $125 to $250 an hour, or that this next project is going to be $100,000. I've never asked for that, or whatever the situation is that makes them feel uncomfortable. And this is where I invite people to do the mirror test. And this is something you should actually do. You should actually practice, and you should do it daily until you don't have to worry about it anymore. And go in front of the mirror and you pretend the customer just asked for your price. And we talked at the beginning about how this might come up at the beginning of the sales cycle, and you're going to give a range. So if you're used to hemming and hawing, think about what you want to say. And just to be hypothetical, you could just say, well, obviously it depends, but typically these types of projects are between $25,000 and $250,000. I know that's a big range. You just sound really comfortable, right? If you go into an Apple store and buy an iPhone, they tell you the range of prices for an iPhone. They don't apologize for it. They don't hem and haw. They don't make it sound like anyone would be crazy to spend that money. They just say, here's what it is. Here's the price points. You need to be comfortable doing that. And then the actual price in your proposal, same thing. You need to be able to say out loud to the mirror and to your prospect, the price is X. This project is $135,000. My rate is $300 an hour, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. And it should just be very matter of fact. You're not bragging. You're not apologizing. You're just stating something. We often get so wrapped up in our own discomfort around price, that discomfort is going to rub off on the prospect. And even if they're feeling good up until that point, you don't want them to lose confidence in you because you don't have confidence in your own price. So literally, stand in front of the mirror, ask yourself the question, respond to it. It's going to sound really weird. And then sooner or later, it sounds more and more natural, until it's completely natural. And it's like someone asking you what your business address is, or some other question that doesn't provoke the same kind of emotional anxiety. Lastly, when you get over the anxiety of pricing, when it's no longer this thing that makes you all worried about it, when you're no longer writing the proposal and just trying to think, oh gosh, I don't know how to price this thing, you can get back to focusing on helping. Hopefully what you really want to do anyway. The more you understand about what the prospect really needs, the better you can understand the value that they're going to get, the better you understand what value they need to perceive, and the better you can price to deliver that value, and the better you can actually deliver the value after they sign the deal. It's a win-win-win. Pricing does not have to be this terrible thing that you apologize for, that you don't feel good about. Focus on helping the customer. Focus on understanding the customer. Price based on the value that you deliver to them, which again is the perceived differential value. That's your limit. Have a plan, not just for your price, but what's going to happen when there's a subsequent pricing conversation or negotiation. Know that you're not going to win everything. If you never get any price objections, you're definitely pricing too low. Price objections are a very healthy signal. If you get them constantly and no one buys, that's a big problem. Maybe you don't understand the value as much as you thought. But you should get them from time to time, and you should be able to address them either by unbundling or explaining why the value is there. And hopefully you've done that in the sales process up to that point so you don't have to recapitulate it at the end. But sometimes people need a reminder of what they're really getting, especially if they're comparing you against a much cheaper alternative. I hope this has cleared up some questions you may have had about pricing and helped you price more effectively, have more fun, win more projects at higher price points, and have more fun delivering those deals. This episode brought to you by Oban Highland Whiskey. They're not actually sponsoring, but if you're out there listening, by all means sponsor. But one of my favorite non-Isla whiskeys, nice honey, vanilla kind of flavor, and a great illustration of how you can charge a lot of money for something but still deliver great value for your customers, not just because it's really, really, really good, but also because you get a whole bunch of servings per bottle and you don't have to worry about preserving it. It ends up on a dollar per glass basis being pretty good. So with that, we'll wrap things up. And if you've got follow-up questions, let me know. There's a link in the show notes. And let me know also what you think about this format. We're going to get back to the interviews for the next few episodes, but I thought it'd be fun just to take a little break every once in a while and answer some of the common questions. Thanks.